Remember the 3-day work week, the energy crisis, the miners' strikes? Seems like ages ago, right?
Right.
But back in '74, Britain, well, let's just say it was a nation facing a lot of problems.
Oh, yeah.
And we're going to dive deep into that year, especially when Harold Wilson came back to power.
Right in the thick of it.
Our main source for this. A great episode of the Rest is History podcast.
A good one.
Get ready for some surprising stuff, maybe even a few flashbacks if you're,
Of a certain age,
Yeah.
It's fascinating, looking back at this time. It really shows you all those anxieties, those tensions bubbling under the surface in British society.
Right.
And for those who actually lived through it, this could be a chance to, think about how those events shaped, your own way of seeing the world.
It's March 4th, 1974. Picture this. You're having your morning tea, opening the newspaper, and bam, headlines about strikes, power cuts, unrest.
Everywhere you look.
Even the England cricket team is being called the weakest ever sent overseas.
Yeah, I remember that.
Maybe a sign of, a wider national malaise.
Feels that way, doesn't it? Like everything's falling apart. And then into this mess steps Harold Wilson.
Right.
Trying to lead the country out of it. Inheriting an energy crisis, crazy inflation, a record trade deficit.
Not an easy job.
Not at all.
And let's be honest, Wilson himself, not exactly a picture of, youthful vigor at this point.
No.
Described as brilliant, sure, but also weary, prone to illness, and maybe, just maybe, a little too fond of the brandy.
There are stories, from his advisors talking about his drinking, how it might have affected his performance. Makes you wonder how much were personal struggles, influencing big political decisions at such a crucial time.
And then there's the drama behind the scenes at number 10, almost like a political soap opera.
A bit, yeah.
With Marcy Williams, Wilson's fiercely loyal, some might say possessive secretary, right at the center of it all.
Oh, Marcia. She's an enigma, that one. Some sources say she had this almost hypnotic control over Wilson. Led to some real blow-ups, let me tell you. We gotta unpack this. Was she a master manipulator? Or just a fiercely loyal woman trying to, navigate this sexist political world?
Because, come on, a secretary throwing fits over lunch menus, berating the prime minister for sneaking out for a sandwich. It's almost comical.
Yeah, you could see it that way. But remember, all this personal drama, it was happening against a backdrop of a real national crisis, And the sources, they paint this picture of Marcia. She had real influence, even controlled what information got to Wilson. And that raises a big question. How much did this power dynamic affect his ability to govern, to actually do his job?
So in the middle of all this internal chaos, how does Wilson try to tackle the very real problems facing the country? He introduces this thing called the social contract, a policy meant to calm the unions down by offering big wage increases in exchange for, promises of industrial peace. Now, for those of us who maybe don't remember all the details of 1970s economic policy,
I don't blame you.
Can you break down this social contract and why it didn't work out?
Sure. The idea behind it was, shared responsibility. The government would give the unions something, and in return, the unions would, ease up on their demands, help stabilize things.
Right.
Unfortunately, it didn't quite go as planned. Inflation, it just kept spiraling out of control.
Yeah.
The cost of living skyrocketed. Everyday things, sugar, tinned soup, massive price increases across the board.
I can't imagine that. Seeing prices on basic stuff going through the roof.
Ah.
For those who lived through it,
Tough time.
those empty shelves in the supermarkets, the long queues, must have been, a real reminder of the mess the country was in.
Absolutely. And that's where you see the unintended consequences of this social contract.
Yeah.
Some people, sure, they benefited from the higher wages. But others, pensioners, people on fixed incomes, they were hit hard by the rising cost of living. It created this division, this gap between those protected by strong unions and those who, weren't.
So it really does paint a picture of a nation on edge.
Very much so.
And this unease, it starts to, seep into other areas, fueling anxieties about a potential right-wing coup. Wilson, already, prone to fixating on intelligence matters,
Always looking over his shoulder.
becomes increasingly paranoid, convinced that shadowy forces are working against him. Was this paranoia justified? Or was it just, Wilson's own anxieties sort of projected onto the national stage?
Hard to say, really.
Yeah.
But it definitely adds another layer to the whole story, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah,
Feels like we're in a spy movie or something.
a bit, yeah.
A prime minister fighting his own demons, a power-hungry secretary pulling strings. Whispers of a coup plot in the shadows.
You can't forget the context, though.
Right.
This is the Cold War, right? Threat of nuclear war hanging over everyone.
Yeah.
And closer to home, what's happening in Northern Ireland?
Uh-huh.
A stark reminder that political instability, violence, not just abstract concepts.
No, not at all. And speaking of Northern Ireland, in 74, the Ulster Workers' Council, a group with ties to loyalist paramilitaries,
Right.
launched a general strike. Their goal, bring down the power-sharing government.
And they were effective, weren't they?
Go ahead.
I mean, within days, Belfast was paralyzed, armed men controlling the streets, factories, businesses, everything shut down.
Wow.
And the British Army, they were there, but mostly just stood by, didn't want a full-blown confrontation, you see.
Right.
It really showed how vulnerable even a seemingly stable democracy could be.
It must have been terrifying for people in mainland Britain to see that. Almost like, I don't know, a glimpse of what could happen if things went off the rails in their own backyard. Did this vulnerability, did it fuel the anxieties about a potential coup in Britain itself?
I think so, yeah. For those already worried about where the country was headed, what happened in Northern Ireland just confirmed their fears.
Right.
It was proof in their minds that radical groups, unions, paramilitaries, they could hold the government hostage.
And then you've got figures like General Sir Walter Walker, retired military leader, known for his, well, inflammatory rhetoric.
To say the least.
And Colonel David Sterling, founder of the SAS, talking openly about rule by the gun to restore order. These weren't just fringe figures, were they? They had a platform, a following. Did anyone really believe a coup was possible?
Well, there's no hard evidence that a coup was actually planned. But the fact that these ideas were being discussed so openly, even in newspapers and government circles, it tells you something about the level of anxiety, you know?
Yeah. And you can't ignore the impact of Wilson's personality on all this paranoia.
Oh, absolutely not.
He's always been fascinated by espionage, by spy stuff, even making cryptic remarks about shadowy forces working against him. It's almost like he was, I don't know, feeding the conspiracy theories himself.
He wasn't helping, that's for sure. And right-wing publications like Private Eye, already critical of Wilson, they jumped on this, speculating that he was a KGB agent.
No.
It created this cycle of suspicion and distrust, really hard to break out of.
It's amazing how quickly things can spiral out of control when you have, well, a volatile political situation, a leader who seems, prone to paranoia,
Right.
and a media that loves sensationalism.
Exactly.
And this unease, this atmosphere wasn't just in politics.
No.
It seeped into popular culture, too.
Oh, for sure. Think about John le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Came out that summer. A story full of betrayal, conspiracy, distrust within the intelligence services. It captured the mood perfectly.
And David Bowie's Diamond Dogs, that dystopian album, also released in '74. It seemed like everyone, novelists, filmmakers, were exploring themes of, I don't know, societal collapse, urban decay.
Mm-hmm.
Was this art imitating life? Or were these cultural products actually shaping how people saw reality?
Probably a bit of both, wouldn't you say? Art reflects the anxieties of the time, sure, but it can also amplify them, make them feel more real, more immediate.
So we have a nation struggling with economic hardship, political instability, this pervasive sense of dread, of paranoia. It must have felt like everything was falling apart. How did people cope with that, with this constant uncertainty?
I imagine for a lot of people, it was a time of real anxiety, even fear. When you're constantly told the economy's collapsing, the government's incompetent, there are shadowy forces plotting.
Yeah.
It's got to affect your outlook, doesn't it? You start to question everything, see threats everywhere.
It's almost like the fear and suspicion became self-fulfilling prophecies. The more people worried about things falling apart, the more likely it was that they would. Did this climate, this anxiety, did it actually contribute to the problems, or was it just a symptom of them?
That's a great question. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did the anxiety create the problems, or did the problems create the anxiety? Probably a bit of both, I'd say. But what's clear is that this atmosphere of fear and distrust, it made it much harder to find solutions to the very real challenges facing the country.
So, 1974. Britain feels like it's on the verge of something,
Yeah.
The economy's a mess, the unions are restless, talk of coups, conspiracies.
Mm-hmm.
What does Wilson do? He calls a snap election in October,
Oh.
hoping for a stronger mandate.
That was a gamble.
He was.
Calling an election so soon after the last one
Yeah.
could have backfired spectacularly. He could have lost it all.
So did it work? Was he able to pull Britain back from the brink?
Well, the October election, it ended up a hung parliament.
Okay.
Labor, they got just 3 more seats than the Conservatives. Not exactly the decisive win Wilson was hoping for,
No.
but it did give him a slim majority, enough to, stay on as prime minister.
He hangs on, but it doesn't sound like a triumphant return.
No, not really.
Did they manage to get a handle on the economic crisis, the social unrest?
Mixed bag, honestly. The economic problems they dragged on through the 70s
Right.
led to that infamous winter of discontent in, 78, 79? But politically, things did seem to calm down a bit after that October election.
Maybe that snap election, as risky as it was, maybe it did something.
Yeah.
Maybe it helped, I don't know, diffuse some of the tension, gave people a chance to breathe,
Yeah.
step back from the edge.
Possibly, yeah. Sometimes just having an election, giving people a voice can be enough to let off some steam.
Thinking back on all this, on this tumultuous year,
Mm-hmm.
what stands out to you most? What resonates?
I think how quickly stability, certainty can just vanish.
Yeah.
Britain in the early 70s, it wasn't that different from Britain today.
Right.
Or any Western democracy, really.
We tend to take our institutions, our way of life, for granted.
We do.
But history shows us how fragile they can be.
Very much so.
That's a bit sobering, isn't it? That even in a country like Britain, with a long history of democratic values, things can unravel so quickly when you have, well, economic hardship, social unrest, political instability.
And don't forget about fear, paranoia. When those in power, or those who want power, they exploit people's anxieties. It creates this toxic environment. Rational debate, compromise, it all becomes impossible.
We see that today in different ways, don't we?
We do, unfortunately.
It's a reminder to stay vigilant, to think critically, to challenge those who try to divide us, who exploit our fears for their own gain.
Absolutely. But we also need to remember that even in the darkest times, there's always hope. Britain in 74 facing huge challenges, but in the end, democracy held on.
Yeah.
The institutions held. The country found a way forward.
So we end our deep dive into 1974 with a few questions for you to think about. How much did the events of this year shape the course of British history? How close did Britain really come to, I don't know, a collapse? And what lessons can we learn from this turbulent time, lessons that we can apply to the challenges we face today?
Good questions to ponder. And we encourage you to delve deeper into this fascinating and often overlooked period in British history. You might be surprised by what you find and how relevant it still is today.